Hello, curious people. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Curious People Wanted, a series produced by the Barnum Museum. I'm Adrienne Saint-Pierre, and I'm the curator of the museum's collections here in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Among my favorite items in the gallery is this modestly sized poster featuring a man named George Costentenus, who was born in the early 1830s. I guess I don't need to say that he was visually remarkable, especially in his era, because he was tattooed from head to toe, apparently everywhere except his ears. The total number of tattoos was said to be 387 or 388. As you see, the design is rather dense and features animals such as fish, birds, and serpents. Most of these figures appear to our eyes to be fanciful, but they were more than that. They all had a symbolic meaning in another culture, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. The primary ink color you see here is light blue, although some descriptions assume that this was the blue dye stuff from indigo. It's almost certain that it was soot actually used to make the colorant. And here it appears to be enhanced with highlights of vermilion red. This is a pigment made from a substance called cinnabar, which is toxic. I have seen some other images that show much more of that red in the design than you see here. But since there are no color photographs from this period, it's too early for that, it's hard to know what Captain Costentenus really looked like. Supposedly, the soles of his feet and the palms of his hand were solidly colored vermilion red as well. Well, just a brief comparison to more recent tattooing history. In this country, tattooing became more mainstream and socially acceptable in the 1970s, and its popularity has grown ever since. So, how does Costentenus compare to the person who currently holds the Guinness World Record for having the most tattoos? That man is a 42-year-old New Zealander known as Lucky Diamond Rich, and he is completely covered, 100%, no gaps at all, and apparently has some layered tattoos as well. So he does have Costentenus beat in terms of surface coverage. But in the 1800s, tattoos were quite unfamiliar to most people in Western culture, unless maybe you lived in a port city where there were sailors. Even so, the ink on Costentenus would have totally wowed his 19th century audiences. Turning back to our poster again, this is a color lithograph. That was a print method that was developed in the early 1800s, but didn't come into its own for commercial use until about the 1860s and the 70s. And this poster dates to that time period, the 1870s. The lithographic method involves drawing on an extremely smooth stone using grease pencils, which are like really fine crayons. And so in the printing process, under pressure, the image is transferred from the stone to paper. And this poster is an example of really good color lithography with its fine detail and beautiful color. Being in color, it certainly captures Costentenus's rather exotic appearance with a thick black beard that covered half his face. And yes, Costentenus really did look like this. His long hair was parted in the middle and then braided and wrapped over his head. The poster portrait was copied from a photograph, which was black and white, of course. And this being a print, that image is reversed from the original photograph. At the top, we see that the poster was promoting him as an attraction in Barnum's Greatest Show on Earth. But what might surprise you is that he wasn't discovered by Barnum. Costentenus had been exhibiting himself for several years before he signed with Barnum in 1876. He was exhibiting in Paris, Berlin, London, and other cities. In fact, we have in our collection this carte de visite, a souvenir photograph of him that was made in Paris. Honestly, you really can't see the tattoos in this photograph at first glance, only the merest hint. But more than likely, you're going to take a second look if you saw this, just because here is this man posing with no clothes and only the merest covering, which would be shocking enough in the Victorian era, let alone a man completely covered in tattoos. So, what was Costentenus' story? The exact truth about his life and the circumstances of his acquiring the hundreds of tattoos it's hard to get at, because there were variations of this story and, well, it gets complicated. What we get here in the caption at the bottom describes Captain Costentenus as the Greek Albanian, tattooed from head to toe in Chinese Tartary. That's an old name for the northern and western regions of China. And this was punishment for engaging in rebellion against the king. Now, that sounds very Barnum-esque, doesn't it? Being captured and then tattooed as punishment or torture. So I assumed that was a story that Barnum made up to promote Costentenus, at the very least more sensational than factual. But I was mistaken. At least I was mistaken about the story being invented by Barnum, although his advertising team probably had a lot to do with condensing Costentenus' story into a concise tale that was easily repeated. But Barnum didn't manufacture the essence of this story. The fact is that there were multiple versions of the story, and Costentenus himself was responsible for a lot of that. It was noted by some of the medical experts who studied him that he was not consistent with his story. Added to that, retelling and promotion done by others like Barnum surely altered it as well. So when all's said and done, probably no one but the man himself knew the real truth. Many times it was stated he was born in Albania and his family were Greek Christians, but even that may not be correct. He is said to have spoken many languages, and perhaps there's reason to think there's validity to the claim. But as to the heart of the story, how he came to be tattooed, well, that's where we find many variations and conflicting information, such as Costentenus was reported to have been a pirate who was captured along with others, half of whom were killed and the others subsequently died as captives. Another version is that he was an adventurer traveling with an American companion and a Spanish companion on a mining expedition, and they got caught up in a rebellion opposing the king. A parallel to that version is that he was a pirate adventurer who participated in a French expedition to Burma seeking gold. That would be the mining expedition. The Burmese government then considered them a threat, and so the 12 men were captured by Royal Burmese soldiers. 9 of them were executed, leaving Costentenus and 2 others, presumably the American and the Spaniard, alive. The story continues that they were punished by enduring the pain of tattooing, which went on for months, and that was surely an exaggeration. According to Costentenus, the process was so painful that it took 4 men to hold him down. He and the 2 others eventually escaped. If the story about the American and Spaniard is true, well, he claimed that both men died only a few months after the escape, or one died and then the other went blind first and then died. One version also says that Costentenus himself became sick and spent time recovering in Manila. Perhaps all 3 suffered from the toxic effects of cinnabar. It's 96% mercuric sulfide. That can cause renal failure and blurred vision, among other things. Whether Costentenus really became sick is debatable, and whether he had companions is also debatable, but he claimed that after his escape to southern China, he traveled not only to the Philippines, but also to Hong Kong, and then through the Suez Canal. And it was when he reached Vienna, Austria, that he was examined by medical professors from the medical university. He was a human curiosity. This was in 1870 when Costentenus was at the General Hospital in Vienna. In particular, he drew the attention of a professor who had founded a medical school devoted to dermatology, the study of skin. This professor, Ferdinand Ritter von Hebra, was so intrigued by Costentenus that he hired a professional photographer, a man named Ludwig, Angerer to take a full-length portrait of him, fairly large format for the time, and with not a speck of clothing on. In November of 1871, the results of all the examinations in Vienna were published in the British Journal of Medicine, so at that point, a lot more people came to know of the case of Costentenus. Now, Ludwig Angerer happened to be the court photographer for the Austrian emperor, so these were high-quality photographs he was creating. Experts in Europe studied the tattoos and authenticated them as Burmese, with the traditional animals, scattered symbols, and even characters that form text in the design. The animals each have particular meanings, their own power or magic. And in the Burmese culture, tattooing was believed to have magical powers. So, for example, it would give a man strength that would protect him in war. So I find it curious that any captives would have been tattooed like this, especially men from a different culture. That does not seem logical. And as far as the story of this happening in Chinese Tartary, well, that does not make sense geographically speaking, because Burma, now known as Myanmar, is well to the south of the area that was called Chinese Tartary. Well, to see if I could make better sense of the conflicting accounts, I contacted historian Amelia Clem Osterud, author of The Tattooed Lady, A History. She is finishing a biography of George Costentenus, which will be published in late 2023. Here's what she had to say. Costentenus' stories about being tattooed and tortured were standard for tattooed performers like him, and they're all absolutely fake. While there were only a handful of tattooed performers before Costentenus, several of them had already used a similar storyline to explain their tattoos, that they were traveling somewhere and were captured by natives who tortured them with tattoos. This storyline tapped into the popularity of the captivity narrative, which was a standard storytelling trope at the time, as it helped people try to make sense of encounters they were having with people who were not at all like them. Costentenus used that storyline to explain away his decision to get fully tattooed and exhibit himself for money. We don't actually know why he chose to get tattooed, and likely never will, but he needed to be able to explain his choice to audiences in a way that they understood and also entertained them. The stories that tattooed performers told were part of the entertainment. They augmented the tattoos, and they sound completely ridiculous and don't make a lot of sense. One more thing I'd like to show you. We have an advertisement dating to 1876, the first year Costentenus showed with Barnum. By the way, this was only 5 years into Barnum's circus enterprises. In the middle here is a short description titled, "The Most Memorable of Mortal Marvels." You gotta love the alliteration. The first lines about Costentenus repeat what we see on the poster, but then it goes on to note that Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes and 4 other leading Boston physicians had made the following statement. I'll paraphrase because the text is like one super long sentence in which you've forgotten the beginning by the time you get to the end. Basically, this person is remarkable as combining in one exhibition a picture gallery, a menagerie of strange animals in their portraiture, including one not unlike the dodo, and a proof of how much suffering man can inflict or another man can bear, the Constitution accommodating itself to conditions which might seem incompatible with health and even with life. He is the most perfect specimen of genuine tattooing which any of us have ever seen. Between 1876 and 1880, Costentenus exhibited on and off again with Barnum. At one point, he and Colonel Goshen, who was a giant employed by Barnum, got into a fight, and that caused quite a stir, or so one is led to believe. Perhaps it was good business, though Barnum always promoted his shows as being strictly moral and free from any objectionable behaviors like drunkenness and fighting. I suspect Costentenus was at heart a very restless person, and records show he was back and forth across the Atlantic in the 1880s and 90s. He did become a U.S. citizen, but it is unknown if he died here. I am sure we will learn much more about him from Amelia Osterud's forthcoming biography. The title is TBD, but you can always check out the publisher's website, Modern Vaudeville Press. Thanks for joining me today, and I will look forward to sharing another story on our next episode of Curious People Wanted. See you then.